President Trump's new 21-point Gaza plan promises peace, freedom for the hostages, even the end of Hamas. But as he meets Prime Minister Netanyahu at the White House, one question looms. What's the hidden cost? Because behind the headlines, this deal might demand the unthinkable and the impossible. Stick around. We're pulling back the curtain on today's episode.
Shalom, I'm Mark Regev, and welcome to another episode of Israel Undiplomatic. And as per usual, I'm here with my co-host, Ruthie Blum.
Hello, Mark. It's good to see you again. There's a lot, as usual, there's a lot to unpack. So let's begin by talking about this so-called 21-point plan that President Trump has put forth with the help of Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, I understand, and also Tony Blair. So, and do we know whether it's also was let's say, forged with the help of someone from Netanyahu's office, namely Ron Dermer? What do you think is going on there, and what are we going to see from this deal?
So it's a very ambitious proposal. The idea is to end the war, get all the hostages out, not have Hamas in power in Gaza, and see the Gaza Strip demilitarized, that it will no longer be a threat to Israel, which is basically Israel's war aims. Demilitarize Hamas, no longer Gaza should be a threat for Israel, right? You know, that it's good. You are right that the devil can be in the details. I would argue, and maybe we would disagree about this, that if we are getting what we want strategically, we can be more flexible on maybe some of the smaller tactical issues, which we'll discuss. The big question is this. We know that this is the American proposal. We know there are still some moving parts. We know that basically Israel's on board. Interestingly, we know the Arab and Muslim countries are on board, important allies of Hamas. Turkey's on board, apparently Qatar is on board, other Arab and Muslim countries are on board. And apparently, the open question is, will Hamas agree? Because there have been all these proposals on the table in the past, and Hamas has not agreed. They have not agreed to release all the hostages. They've not agreed to disarm. Is it possible now? And the optimists are saying it's possible now precisely because the Turks and the Qataris, the people who are Hamas's natural allies and friends, yes, the people who are in that axis together, that if they're for the deal, they can bring Hamas when in the past it was impossible to bring Hamas. We have to wait and see.
Or one could argue that if those evil leaders, such as Erdogan of Turkey, are in on it and support something, that you have to be extremely wary and think that's not good. But forget about that for a minute. What I would argue, and I think this is true, that the Israeli entry, the IDF entry into Gaza City or surrounding Gaza City, the stepping up of military operations, coupled with the assassination attempt of Hamas leaders in Qatar, actually had an effect, actually caused Qatar to say to Hamas, we're not now pressuring you, get out of here, you're causing us more trouble than it's worth. I know that everybody said, oh my God, President Trump reprimanded Israel for trying to assassinate the Hamas leaders in Qatar, but actually maybe this contributed to the fact that there seems to be some kind of deal on the table. Now, the trouble is here, again, I would agree with you, of course, that if we can get all the hostages back, including if that means releasing, 1,000 terrorists from Israeli jails, which of course I'm against. And we saw that it was because of such a release from prisons in Israel that we got Sinwar, who orchestrated the October 7th massacre. Having said that, we do have to pick our battles, so to speak, not just in the battlefield, but also in terms of our thinking. And so there are certain things we should be willing to do. Also, as I always say, keeping our powder dry and being ready to kill any terrorists who pose a threat. But what concerns me, well, there's two things. First of all, I just find it impossible to believe that Hamas is going to say, okay, we're going to release all the hostages. I just find it impossible to believe. And because of that, even President Trump, one thing we have to say, whatever Trump has said in these last days, including I'm not going to allow Israel to extend sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, so-called, he's been extremely clear about the need to release all the hostages. Now, Hamas, meantime, is saying, we didn't see any 21-point proposal. So I'm very, very skeptical. And I'm also skeptical about the fact that what seems to be included in these points, now we don't know. A lot of this is leaked stuff. Maybe it's not even true. One of the things that seems is that some kind of Palestinian entity is going to also have eventual governing capabilities in Gaza, and that should be a total no-no. There, I think, is a real problem, and if Netanyahu has to agree, of course he's going to agree to a plan that releases all the hostages, but there has to be a backdoor agreement that one bullet, one threat, and the IDF is at liberty to go back in and do everything it's doing now again, which is not an ideal situation to keep going back in, coming back out, and going back in, which is what we had all these other years. So I'm just very skeptical about it.
Look, I agree with you 100% when you say this is only happening also because the IDF is going into Gaza City and Hamas is under military pressure. And the hope of the optimist is the combination of that military pressure and the diplomatic pressure, which will now hopefully come from Qatar and from Turkey on Hamas, that can maybe get you over the finish line. Maybe. Just here I have to do open parentheses and say all those European do-gooders who are saying Israel shouldn't be doing and we should cease fire, they just don't understand what's going on, because it's Israel's fire that is maybe making this deal possible. And they're just stupid when they say, ceasefire, stop the war. They don't understand. That's the opposite of really wanting to get a deal that stops the war. You raised the issue correctly of Qatar's role here. Now, it's been widely reported in the Israeli press and in other places. I don't know if it's true, but it's been reported that the Americans have asked the Qataris to say to Hamas, if you don't accept this deal, you have to leave Qatar. Now, the Hamas leadership has a very, very nice time there in Qatar. They live in their 5-star hotels. They live a very nice life. And if they are threatened with exile from Qatar, if that is true, those reports, that could be very, very important leverage. Once again, we don't know if those reports are true, but that's the sort of pressure that we need. It's also a way to square the circle, because you'll recall that Netanyahu said, we will take out Hamas wherever they are, correct? We will find them and bring them to justice. And Trump has said publicly that he doesn't want Israel attacking Hamas people in Qatar anymore, like we did a few weeks ago. And so if there's a deal and we agree that as part of the deal that Hamas leaders can leave Gaza and so forth, there's a way to square that circle that can work for everyone. But once again, I agree with you when you said it's quite possible, despite all the criticism at the time when Israel went after the Hamas leaders in Qatar, that maybe that has helped move things forward. Also, maybe that also incentivizes the Qataris. When they like to play the peacemaker, even though they've got, their blood on their hands. We know that. But they like to play the responsible peacemaker. They suddenly understood that if this continues, it affects them also. The Israeli Air Force comes and visits their country in the middle of the night, not targeting them, targeting Hamas, but they don't like that. And so is it possible that the Israeli strike has actually helped us get to where we are now?
I actually believe that. I have no doubt that it helped, because they said it's one thing when we talk and talk, but, if a building gets bombed and all that, we don't want that. You're a headache. Okay, Hamas has become a headache for them. Trouble is that even if they are exiled, even if they're kicked out of Qatar, so they'll go to Turkey it's not, listen, the trouble with all of these deals and the trouble with the world an axis that's created, let's say, with common interests, for example, anti-Iran axis. The trouble with it is that you're talking about also enemies of Israel and supporters of terrorism. Turkey also housed Hamas. I mean, so we're always caught between a rock and a hard place in this sense. And the irony about all these deals, and first of all, I find it really outrageous that even Israeli politicians, not just Europeans, all right, the Israeli oppositionist politicians talk about this as though the Israeli government has been intransigent. So far, throughout this war, the Israeli government has agreed to every single hostage deal on the table, every single one, and has gotten as many hostages as possible out of there. The idea somehow that, and it's not just Netanyahu specifically, but to blame the government for the fact that the hostages are still, the remaining 48 hostages, 20 of whom are alive, are still there, it just is enraging because it feeds into this false European narrative. You say they're just being stupid about you just have a ceasefire and end the war. You know, I don't give the Europeans the benefit of the doubt of being stupid. I really think there's something more pernicious at work than stupidity. But okay, you know, let's say they're being stupid. The Israeli opposition has no excuse for being stupid in that way. And it really is, it feeds into the anti-Semitism in the world right now that somehow Israel is an aggressor. Israel is not doing anything for peace. And so I spend a lot of time with my mouth hanging open over our oppositionist politicians in power today, and of course, former ones who go around the world and basically parrot anti-Semitic tropes.
So I just remind you that in a parliamentary democracy, the job of the opposition is to oppose. And it's their job to criticize the government, and they're supposed to be an alternative. When in a time of war, they're supposed to also be a source of national unity and so forth, and to say, we support the government on this and that and the other. Like in Netanyahu's speech in the UN, he talked about, what was it, the 99 members of the Knesset who were against Palestinian statehood. And he said that's the overall they represent, that's 90% of Israel. It was important to him to say that on issues like that, the opposition is with me. I'm not somehow, out of touch with the Israeli political reality. I'm not being led by a bunch of, loony extremists who are pushing me in a direction where Israel wants to go. In other words, the opposition has a job to oppose. One would hope they would do that responsibly, though obviously some of the statements that have come out, maybe not from the active opposition leaders, more from people. Maybe I understand the face you just made. I don't know if the camera picked it up. There have been some statements. But I mean, some of the opposition leaders, you have to feel for them. Some of their numbers are going, one's gone up and the others are going, their numbers are in the toilet. Some of them might not even make it to the next Knesset if you believe the polls, right? So that's politics. You said you're very doubtful, and I think you're not, it's good to be a bit doubtful sometimes that Hamas is going to agree to this anyway, even if there's this deal on the table and Turkey and Qatar supported, and there'll be all this pressure from their friends and allies, yes, from their axis to support the deal, and it might not happen anyway, and that's possible. We don't know what Hamas is going to do. We can be hopeful there's going to be a deal, but it's quite possible, you're right, that Hamas is not going to go, in this direction. Why would they give up all the hostages? They'll start playing games. They'll say we can't find some. There were already some hints of that this morning, 2 hostages. They don't know what's happened to them. They, of course, blame Israel, Israel because of the Israeli strikes. They don't know yet. So, but I would say even in that scenario, the fact that Netanyahu has shown the Americans that he's willing to go the extra mile to try to get a deal, yet again, if you don't mind me saying, I think that's good for Israel. That if this doesn't work, it'll be very, very clear, like it was on the previous Witkoff plan, that Israel accepted and Hamas rejected. I think that's important also. It's also important for Israel to know that we've done everything we could to try to get the hostages out, that we've done everything we could to try to get this ceasefire. If Hamas says no, I think that'll give Israel diplomatic cover, American support, to continue with the military campaign. And Hamas has to know that. If they say no, the military campaign continues and Gaza City will continue to face this Israeli operation, which ultimately is designed to end that one of the two last Hamas strongholds.
Oh, right. But here's the catch here with Hamas is we've already basically destroyed Hamas. Of course, not every single Hamasnik, and of course, not the Hamas supporters in Judea, Samaria, and East Jerusalem. There are many, many Hamas supporters and even some Hamas operatives. But that's not what I mean. We have basically destroyed Hamas, its military capability. We've gotten its leadership, etc. All it has are those hostages. That's all it's got. Now, and they keep recruiting. They used the humanitarian aid as a recruitment tool for new terrorists to replace the ones who've been killed by going to a family with teenage sons and saying, we'll give you food if you give us your son. So because of that, we know that new ones are being recruited all the time, but the only real leverage they have are the hostages. So they don't really have an interest in ending the war since they don't care about human life, not their own, certainly not the hostages. It's all they've got. So I'm trying to understand what would persuade them to give that up. The other side of this also, as Netanyahu pointed out during his UN speech, he also had to make clear that recognizing Palestinian statehood under these conditions, or at this point any conditions, is wrong. And the Palestinian Authority, which I believe is also included in this 21-point plan, Palestinian Authority is saying, yes, we want Hamas to give up its weapons and give them to us. See, of course, the Palestinian Authority hates Hamas, which is why Mahmoud Abbas has not held elections in 20 years, because he knows that Hamas will win and he'll be out of power. But we can't allow that either. So the issue is not just what's going on with the rest of the deal, but that specifically the hostages. What would Hamas gain? I'm trying to understand. We know what the PA would gain if the West buys into their crap and their lies that they're not terrorists. But what would Hamas gain by returning the hostages? And I can't think of something.
Well, the jury's out. Once again, one would hope that because of a confluence of factors, the Israeli military operation and the threat of that just getting even more intensive, their close friends and allies, the people who, that's their focus group, so to speak, the Turks and the Qataris, the situation, is it possible? And the threat, if it's true, the threat that they would be thrown out of Qatar, which is where they live their luxurious lives, the leadership, yes. Could all that be a game changer? As I said, the jury's still out. You raised the issue of the Palestinian Authority. And I know we've had these conversations before. Here, I said at the very beginning of my remarks, I said there are things that Israel doesn't like maybe in the 21 points. There are the same things that Israel likes along. And I'm saying is the strategic gain, if this deal does work, does that outweigh any sort of tactical issues? And I believe it does. And I think there are some, apparently, and no one's seen the final draft yet. Maybe there isn't a final draft yet. Netanyahu said in this interview on Sunday, he said it's still work in progress, yes? But language like there's got to be a pathway to a future Palestinian state. So I believe it's possible to finesse language. I was a diplomat for all those years, and that's what diplomats do. They play with language. Kissinger once used the famous phrase, you have diplomatic ambiguity. You can do all sorts of things if it's wording. It's not, once again, they're not asking to establish a Palestinian state. They want some sort of framework, pathway to Palestinian statehood. And there are a number of ways to deal with that. And one of the ways was done by Ariel Sharon in 2003 with the famous roadmap that George W. Bush put on the table. And Israel had trouble with some of that as well. And so we accepted the document in principle, and then we had a list of, what was the word, reservations. And so Israel has the right to accept the document and then express its reservations, and it can make those reservations official. They can be a decision of the government, a decision of the cabinet. And so that's one way of dealing with it. I think another way of dealing with it, this idea that the PA plays some sort of future role in Gaza, and we know what you think about that, And there's a way to guarantee that that role is only symbolic. And there's a way, even if it is only symbolic, to make it, the PA has theoretically committed to reform and to change its bad behavior, its funding of terrorism and its hate speech and its education system, which encourages young Palestinian state Jews and so forth. And so you could, if you condition Palestinian PA involvement in a future Gaza on them actually following through on their promises. Now, they've always promised and they never follow through on their promises. So it could be a pretty safe bet for Israel to say we condition, and then they've, of course, committed to all these things, so they can't disagree with the conditioning. And so that's a way, I think, of finessing some of these issues, which are apparently in the 21 points, which are maybe a bit difficult for Israel to digest.
Yeah, but the trouble with finessing those, and you're right, Israel has the right to make reservations, but what we've seen since the Oslo Accords is it's not just that they don't keep their promises to reform, et cetera, and not fund terrorism, et cetera. It's not just that. It's that they pay no price for it. Okay? I mean, that's all well and good if you want to be, you and say, oh, diplomatic ambiguity. Okay, fine. But to what end? All right. If the point is what happens when they violate it. Now, my position is we have to completely cancel the Oslo Accords, which are dead anyway, completely disband the PA, the Palestinian Authority. It is just a terrorist organization in business suits. We cannot. It serves no positive purpose, and it does endanger Israel. And it's unlike Gaza, which, okay, we withdrew from Gaza, and Gaza is on a border. The PA is right inside our borders. The PA endangers our airspace, our electromagnetic fields, our airport, and we're seeing that every day terrorism is both the PA residents have been committing acts of terror against Israelis, but also many have been thwarted. And I know this from somebody who works in the border police. Every single day, there are massive terrorist attacks that do not happen because they are thwarted. This is right inside Israeli borders. So my position is that the PA has to be disbanded, not say, okay, well, if you reform, we know they're not going to reform. That's like saying, well, of course, if they reformed, it would be like saying if Hamas reformed, then they wouldn't be who they are, all right? Because Fatah is Arafat's legacy, where the party that, the faction that Mahmoud Abbas belongs to is Fatah. That's the PLO. That was Arafat. These are arch terrorists who have the plan of stages, unlike Hamas, who says, let's just kill all the Jews now as fast as we can. But the PA has the plan of stages, and we see that in their media, mosque sermons, school books, and they're dedicating sports games to martyrs. We see that. So there's no chance of their reforming. It's got to be a whole different, there's no chance.
But if that's true, and it could well be true, then Israel doesn't have a problem. Because if you say Palestinian involvement, PA involvement in the future government of Gaza as part of a consortium, yes, they wouldn't be have a monopoly or anything like that, right? Is conditioned on them doing A, B, and C. And they can't do A, B, and C, or they refuse to do A, B, and C, whatever the reason, that means they don't get their role. That's the price they pay. You say, you asked before the question, what price they pay? If they want involvement in Gaza, they have to take these steps. If they don't take these steps, it's not going to happen. And so you can say either way is a good result for Israel. I also think it's important to stress on the security issue that Israel, in any framework, and this has to be part of the 21 points, Israel has to have overriding security control. Because let's be very frank, no one, not Americans, not French people, not Emiratis, not Saudis, no one's going to demilitarize Hamas. No one's going to make sure that Hamas is demilitarized. No one's going to make sure that Gaza is demilitarized except for Israel. We're the only people who are going to do that. And so it's crucial that as this goes forward, that Israel remains. It doesn't mean that we have to collect the rubbish and we have to be a civilian controlling Gaza. From the very beginning of this war, the prime minister, the government said we're open to a civilian Palestinian regime government in Gaza that's not anti-Israel, that's not hostile to Israel, that wants to live in peace with Israel. I think the Prime Minister reiterated that in his speech at the UN just a few days ago. But security control has to be in our hands. No one else will do that job, right? No one else will do that job. That was all the Europeans, we spoke about the do-gooders before, or, they said, oh, we want a Palestinian state, but of course Hamas has nothing to do with that future state. And say, okay, who's going to stop them? Hamas, it's only Israel, right? And so I think that's the model. You said to me before, and this is something I do disagree with you very strongly. You said Israel should be calling for the dismantling of the PA. And so you have to ask the following questions. If the PA is not there, what is there in its place? And don't want to be the lawyer for the PA. I agree with all your criticisms of the PA. I disagree with what you say the consequences of those are. I don't think it's not an accident that Netanyahu has been in power now for more than a decade, and he's never once taken a decision to say the PA is, there are all sorts of very practical reasons that despite all the problems with the PA, why Israel has not called for the abolishment of the PA. And we can discuss that more if you're interested in doing so. But once again, that's in no way, I agree with all your criticisms of the PA. The question is, what would happen if there wasn't a PA? Who would have to fill the vacuum? And I think those are difficult questions.
Well, I think, it's interesting what you point out about Netanyahu, and that's true. But Netanyahu, like the rest of Israel, also sees how things have changed. As much as they've changed, they've stayed the same as well. One of the things that changed since October 7th, 2023, we're coming upon the 2-year anniversary. Netanyahu also knew about Qatari money going into Gaza. There was what we call the conceptia. It wasn't just Netanyahu. It was the army, the whole apparatus in Israel thought that what we needed to do was keep the Gazans, and mainly our army said that too, keep the Gazans from being too hungry, etc. We need to give them work permits, and we need to have money flow into Gaza to keep them, appeased or quiet. And now, of course, we all know, we've known this since 9/11 and before, that terrorism is not solved by giving people money. Terrorists are often wealthy. They come from good families.
Osama bin Laden.
Exactly. That's my point. My point is that's nonsense. But okay, I'm not blaming Netanyahu for this. What I'm trying to say is it's the same way that Arik Sharon, when he said, okay, when we disengaged from Gaza, which means yanking every last Jew out of there, he said at the time, one false move, one stone, one rocket, one thing fired over that wall that we create between us and them. Okay, good. You're trying to kill us? Here, take Gaza. No Jews in there, all right? One false move, and we go back in there, and we go to war with them. And we didn't, okay? They started firing on us. We didn't. See, this is what worries me. And when you say, well, Netanyahu, he's had reason to keep the PA. Yeah, he has. And guess what? Maybe he sees that reason is no longer viable, because you said, yes, there's been security cooperation, but that's only because the PA wants to keep Hamas at bay and wants Israel to help it keep Hamas at bay, and not in order to make any kind of peace deals with Israel. Furthermore, Iran also funds the PA. Iran also, you see, so if what we're doing is creating an anti-Iran axis, and the PA is also filled, it's not just with Hamas supporters, it's also Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other factions that are in the Iranian axis. So you have to say, just because Netanyahu all these years had one idea, he is shifting. He also once said that eventually there could be Palestinian state when it reforms and everything. And now he just says, no Palestinian state. And the reason is because reality has taught us all a lesson. And the opposition, you said, not all the job of the Israeli opposition in a parliamentary democracy is to try to, topple the government. That's all well and good. But I wasn't talking about, it's not just fringe. The leader of the Israeli opposition, Yair Lapid, when Netanyahu was addressing the United Nations, he was tweeting things like, "Oh, Netanyahu wants to be like Kim Jong-un." This is the leader of our opposition. He said that Netanyahu's speech was whiny and whatever, and that he was in danger, and that he made Israel's the state of Israel's condition in the world worse. That's an opposite. No, if he wants to criticize Netanyahu and he wants to try to replace Netanyahu, that's the way you do it. When he's battling, when he's going off to deliver a speech at the United Nations with countries that are openly now anti-Semitic, and you say that. So as I said, there's a new reality now, and our opposition is not a loyal opposition, and Netanyahu sees things differently now since October 7th, as we all do.
So if the opposition leader is trying to make himself relevant, he's not doing a good job because his numbers in the polls, he's in single digits, right?
That's right.
It's not easy for him.
You're right.
Maybe that's why he's saying extreme things, because he's under pressure. I don't know. I wanted to mention from Netanyahu's speech, he was very warm in the way he responded to the Indonesian president's remarks a few days before him. And I think it's not by accident. I don't think anything in that speech is accidental. And Netanyahu spoke about the possibility of having an agreement. He didn't say a peace agreement, normalization, but he talked about an agreement with Syria. He said there are direct, talks going on. He talked about his desire to open up talks with Lebanon. And Trump has spoken before about expanding the Abraham Accords. That's part of his legacy, part of his desire, and why people, the whole Nobel Peace Prize business, yes. And he does deserve one on the Abraham Accords. That he didn't get one, I think, is he should have got them for the Abraham Accords, yes. But now we want to expand that, and people talked about Indonesia as being part of that. People talked about Saudi Arabia as being part of that. And I think also this whole Gaza framework with the Arab countries, is it not also maybe the vehicle to restart and re-energize the normalization process? And that's why I said to you before, and I repeat myself and I apologize for sounding like a broken record, yes? But there might be some tactical things that are difficult for Israel. But if on the larger strategic issues, right, if the goal is to really demilitarize Gaza, to disarm Hamas, and that Israel will remain with overall security control. And in the framework of this ceasefire hostage release deal, Israel's relations with certain leading Arab and Muslim countries will be upgraded. And there's a chance for us to move forward with Syria and Lebanon at the same time, yes? I would argue that this is a good process. Once again, I understand there might be some things here which are difficult for the Israeli public, which are difficult for people like you. I always think, we should never fall into the Palestinian trap and say, if it's not 100% everything we want, we say no, yes? Maybe if it's 95% good for us, that's good enough.
Oh, Mark, that's so funny to say. We don't say if it's not 100% good for us, no. We always say yes when it's 95% bad for us, okay? And we have a history of this, right, under various leaders in Israel. So don't give me that. And all I said is, I'll believe it when I see it if the hostages are out, because if they're not out, none of those other points are irrelevant at all, except it'll mean that we have lost the war, capitulated to Hamas, whatever you want. That is not conducive to any kind of peace in the Middle East. A second point is, I also agree that we should have better relations with our neighbors. The trouble is that the Abraham Accords countries they're sort of backtracking in the sense that originally they all said that the Abraham Accords showed that peace does not necessarily pass, the requirement for peace between Israel and Arab neighbors is not a Palestinian state. And now everyone is saying, well, if there's no Palestinian state, the Abraham Accords are at risk.
Can I correct you?
Yes, please.
Can I correct you?
Yes, please.
The Abraham Accords were established without the creation of a Palestinian state. The language I understand it's in the 21 points, is some sort of pathway, some sort of nebulous direction towards Palestinian statehood, if the Palestinians do A, B, and C, and D, which you think they'll never do anyway. And I think it's important to say that I agree with you when you say there doesn't have to be a Palestinian state for these things to happen, for these good things to happen, yes? But you have to be able to tip the box. There has to be some, even on the Abraham Accords, there was Israel did certain things on the Palestinian track. And so we have to pay the price, which is a price that Israel can pay, because it's not Palestinian statehood, it's something less than Palestinian statehood. That's what I'm saying.
You're saying what we have to do is pay lip service?
Yes.
Lip service is, it's interesting because lip service is important in international diplomacy. It sometimes, though, gets us into big trouble because while we're doing that, and I agree with you, you can say it because, they need it for their internal consumption. Yeah. It's that's not a problem. When is a problem is that it becomes part of the language, the rhetoric, and that has an effect on ideology. It has that affects how people view things. And that's the danger of having lip service. It sort of sink in, and then before you know it, there's a kind of hypnosis, certain terms that we've introduced, and then you can't get rid of them. That's my fear. But again, all I'm saying here is, aside from everything else, and you know that I'm somebody who said we have to achieve real victory over Hamas. But I also have to stress that despite what the Israeli opposition and many, many leftists in Israel and outside of Israel like to think they're the only ones who want to end the war and free the hostages. Let's make it clear that we all want the hostages home and to end the war. We just want to, we need to be not endangered. And the trouble is that Hamas is not freeing the hostages. And without freeing the hostages, that's another point that we won't be victorious. We won't. Okay, I don't consider that victory either. And I am very concerned because we're all talking about this deal. But without the hostages, why should we why should we release bloodthirsty terrorists? Why should we do all kinds of things in Gaza? Let the Hamas leaders go. All of these points have zero meaning if we can't even get the hostages back.
Well, I understand the prerequisite for the 21 points is exactly that. The hostages in the first few days of the deal are supposed to, all the hostages, that the dead and the alive, 20 alive and some 28.
In the first 48 hours.
Right? Yeah, that's supposed to happen. And so this is the deal breaker, right?
Do you believe it'll happen? Let me just ask you, do you believe that Hamas is going to agree to this?
So I don't know. I think there's a confluence of factors now that make it more likely than it was, let's say, 2 weeks ago. Is that enough for it to happen? I don't know. But once again, I said before, and with this we have to finish because we're running out of time, and I apologize. We'll continue this when we meet again next week. But even if Hamas says no, Israel's willingness to entertain these ideas, Israel's willingness to accept these ideas, I think that gives us the ability, if we need to, if Hamas says no, to continue the war until victory.
Amen. And now, before we sign off, I would like to say that this week, the day after tomorrow, we enter the Day of Atonement. And so just to wish all our Jewish viewers or listeners a Gemar Chatima Tova, and we'll be back next week.
Look forward to that.